Hello, this is Kopi Time, a podcast series on markets and economies from DBS Group Research. I'm Taimur Beg, Chief Economist, welcoming you to our 137th episode. Okay, time to travel to Washington, D.C. Today, we will talk about all things U.S. fiscal with Shai Akabas, the Executive Director of the Bipartisan Policy Center's Economic Policy Program. If you Google Shai's name, you'll see a string of articles and interviews on U.S. fiscal policy, retirement and financial security, tax policy, and yes, lots of hits on debt ceiling. Shai Akabas, welcome to Kopi Time.
Thanks so much for having me.
It's great to have you. I want to start with some setting the background type stuff, Shai, if I may. So at the beginning of this century, as the Clinton-Gore team handed over the reins to Bush and Cheney, the U.S. essentially was running a balanced budget. Net debt to GDP ratio was 35%. Things have changed a lot since then. The IMF estimates structural fiscal deficit at 6.7% in 2024, with net debt to GDP closing in on 100%. And looking ahead, no significant consolidation looks likely, and debt ratios are expected to rise for the rest of the decade. Shai, how did we get here?
Well, let me give you the punchline up top, which is that Americans are already straining to cover their bills and invest in their future. And if we don't address this huge national debt that we have racked up over the past several decades, it's going to impact policy in almost every other sector of our society. So we really have a challenge here that both parties have contributed to. There's enough blame to go around. We at the Bipartisan Policy Center take this issue very seriously, and we have focused over the past couple decades at finding pragmatic solutions that could help us address it. The way that we got here, to directly answer your question, is that we have made a series of choices, some that were forced upon us and some that we proactively took ourselves, that have been fiscally irresponsible and have not been paid for either on the spending side or the tax side, that have added to this debt burden that is now, as you said, as large as our economy at around $28 trillion of debt held by the public. It's been a series of decisions that started back in the early 2000s under President Bush when they enacted several unpaid for tax cuts. At that time, we had revenues that exceeded spending. So we had a surplus, which has been very rare in U.S. history. We had revenues that were coming in at around 20% of gross domestic product, GDP, and outlays were at closer to 18%. So we had a fairly large surplus for a few years. And that quickly dissipated. We enacted those tax cuts. We had several wars overseas, including the Iraq War, Afghanistan, Iraq, now more recent conflicts, of course, in Ukraine and the Middle East. And we've also continued to enact unpaid for tax cuts, like most recently in 2017 with the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. On top of that, we, of course, had the Great Recession, and we had unpaid for spending. The most notable one was the American Rescue Plan that was enacted under President Biden and the Democrats to help extract us from the COVID recession, but really most economists felt like was more than necessary and, in fact, contributed to the inflation that we've seen in the U.S. in recent years. All of these decisions have led us to a point in 2024 where our spending is now 24% of GDP compared to that 18% back in 2000. And our revenues are now down around 17% of GDP. So this has flipped, and we're running a roughly 7% of GDP deficit. That's just not sustainable. And we need to put our budget on a more sustainable path. Otherwise, there are going to be severe consequences for our economy. And the problem that we have right now is neither party is prioritizing this issue. There are some who talk about it, but when it comes down to it and their party is in power, often they will enact the policies that they would like to see, whether it's tax cuts or spending in various areas, and put deficits aside for the moment and then come back to them when they're out of power and opposed to the other party's priorities. So we really need to reverse that tide, and the sooner the better.
Shai, I suppose from a politician's perspective, if interest rates are not skyrocketing and the rest of the world is falling over each other to buy U.S. debt, I suppose that exorbitant privilege lulls one into some degree of complacency. So I want to talk about that supply-demand stuff later. But since you brought up the spending and revenue side, let's sort of go through them at a time, perhaps. So on the spending side, your institute does a lot of work on the areas where savings can be achieved. So what are the areas where spending is super rigid? And what are the areas where there's some realistic room for consolidation?
Yeah, we've seen these spending challenges for many years, and a lot of the spending that the U.S. does in its budget is on what are so-called entitlement programs. These are on autopilot. They're mandatory spending, so they're not something that Congress addresses each year in its annual spending process, which largely means that they remain untouched until there's a major reform package that gets put on the table or that gets momentum to be enacted. So the last time, for example, that we saw a major reform package to Social Security was back in 1983. That's 41 years ago that this program has remained largely untouched. No wonder its spending and its revenue are no longer in balance, and it's in desperate need of reform. So that is an example of a program that has run on autopilot for far too long. Medicare largely has run in the same way with a trust fund, but that trust fund is now spending down and is going to be depleted soon. So those are the major entitlement programs that have remained unaddressed, even though we have seen these demographic challenges, because those imbalances are largely driven by demographics in addition to healthcare cost increases. And what we focused on over the past 15 years that has really exacerbated the problem is only the annual discretionary part of the budget, and that is largely defense spending and then other domestic agencies like the Education Department and the Energy Department and the Department of Housing and Urban Development. So all of those portions of the budget are allocated annually appropriated. And the issue is that those also make up the investment parts of our budget. So spending on infrastructure and housing policies and others that really contribute, labor market, that contribute to the future growth of our economy. And if we just continue to constrain that, which is already a shrinking part of the budget relative to those entitlement programs, we're not going to get at the underlying problem. Now, the biggest issue that we have at the moment on the spending side is that interest costs, net interest costs that we are paying on our existing debt are eating up a larger and larger share of our spending and a larger and larger share of our tax revenue. So, for example, just a couple of years ago, those interest costs were consuming about 10% of all the revenue that we were bringing into the federal government. This past year, the fiscal year that just ended at the end of last month, that number had increased to 19%. So it had almost doubled in just a couple of years. Now, that's a result of both increasing debt and, of course, interest costs that have interest rates that have gone up significantly in the past couple of years. So the interest that we paid on the federal debt last year was $950 billion. It's now the second largest category of spending in the federal budget, only after Social Security. It has now exceeded Medicare spending and all the spending that we do on our national defense. And there's also a rising cost of responding to emergencies that we're seeing, which is eating up the budget on an ad hoc basis because we do not budget appropriately for emergencies. We pretend that we're surprised every time we have them, and we are increasingly surprised more and more as things like climate change and other factors around the world have contributed to whether they're weather events or whether they're unforeseen overseas conflicts. And those have increased the budget deficits in recent years as well. So those are the pieces of the budget that are consuming more and more. And instead, we're focused on this shrinking piece of the pie that is discretionary spending. And that's not going to address the challenges that we face over the long run.
So structural reforms urgently needed. Shai, I used to cover various developing countries when I worked at the IMF. And one of the countries was India. And this is like a long time ago. And one of the things we used to say in India is that India used to spend more on interest payment than health and education combined. I think we're there in the US now in some extent. And the defense budget of the U.S. is larger than most of the large economies in the world combined, like close to $900 billion. And to your point, interest spending is over $1 trillion. So even it's outpacing the mega defense of the U.S. So that's, I guess, very well put in terms of context. So let's stay with the structural stuff for a minute. Social Security and Medicare funding. Where are we going with this? I mean, is the trust fund really that sacrosanct? I mean, what if the trust fund runs out of money? Is it a crisis, or money is fungible? It can just print money or take it from somewhere else in the budget. No big deal.
Yeah, this is a huge problem. So we have trust funds for Social Security and Medicare. And as I mentioned, the last time Social Security was reformed was in 1983. And so shortly after those reforms, it was projected that the demographic challenges that we face as a society and the pressures on the program as well as increases in benefits, which are attached to wages, we're going to cause an imbalance in the trust fund that would result in the depletion sometime around when it is now projected to be depleted, which is only in 9 years, in 2033. This is the primary trust fund. There's also a trust fund for disability insurance, which is a much smaller portion of the program, but the old age and survivors insurance portion, which is what goes to all older Americans that are collecting benefits. That portion is only 9 years away from depletion. And again, we've known this for many years. There are several factors that are driving this. There's an aging population, so the beneficiary to worker ratio, which is the number of beneficiaries that are collecting relative to the workers that are paying payroll taxes into that system, has shrunk over time. It went down from 4 to 3, and now we're getting close to 2.5. And that's not a sustainable model if we don't adjust the program in other ways to account for this changing balance. There's also an eroding tax base. We've had increased income inequality over time. And the way that the program is funded is on payroll taxes, which only go up to a certain level of income. And right now, I believe it's about $170,000. And so that means that if we have more earnings that are above that income level, more of the earnings in the economy are not being taxed for the purposes of Social Security. So that has led to an erosion of the tax base at the same time that we are paying out more and more benefits. And that imbalance is only going to increase in the future. So if we reach 2033 and policymakers don't take action, there would be an across-the-board 21% cut to benefits, which is not something that most seniors can afford. This is really irresponsible behavior by policymakers because it's impossible for anyone in the United States who is trying to plan for their retirement to do so in an accurate and responsible manner if they don't know what they're going to be getting out of the Social Security program. Pretty much everybody knows what the menu of reforms are to adjust the program, but for so long it has been the third rail of politics in this country. And it is so easy to demagogue and to make pledges that you're never going to touch, and we've seen that from both sides. That's why it has gone unaddressed for far too long. Basically the same dynamic with Medicare. That primary trust fund, the Medicare Part A trust fund, which goes for hospital insurance, is set to deplete its funds in 2036, so only a few years after Social Security. And in that same way, it would not be able to cover all benefits after that point. These projections move around a little bit as the flows come in and out. But again, we've known that these programs are not in good shape for many years, and policymakers really have not done much to address them. So we need to wrap our arms around this problem and do so in a bipartisan manner. Everything needs to be on the table, and it's going to take adjustments to the benefit side, and it's going to take adjustments to the revenues that are coming into the program, which are insufficient to fund the aging population that we have.
Have there been attempts in the last few decades to make some reforms, or was it really the 1983 reform that was the last time that anything seriously was done?
So on Social Security, that is the last time anything seriously was done. There have absolutely been attempts. So President Bush, for example, initiated a push to try to do this under the second President George W. Bush in the early 2000s, and that was branded as an attempt to privatize Social Security. And there's a lot of nuance to the argument as to what was or was not being proposed. But it got, again, lambasted very quickly, and was easy for the other side to say that, Republicans are coming for your Social Security benefits, and that reform went away. And since then, there has not really been a concerted push. There have been groups of bipartisan policymakers that we have been working with who have, come close to putting something out that people could maybe coalesce around, but the politics are just so difficult. So, for example, in President Biden's State of the Union last year, he made a pledge that nobody was going to touch Social Security, and both parties stood up and gave a round of applause for that. So it's very difficult in that kind of context to get the political will on both sides to go against the tide and send a difficult message that we're going to actually need to adjust these programs in the future in order to sustain them and make sure that they're available to future generations.
Right. So now we've seen tax measures in the last 21 years, large tax cut under Bush, some degree of rationalization under Obama. Of course, those were tough post-financial crisis years. The U.S. economy couldn't really handle major tax increases in those days. And then Trump came, more tax cuts. Biden has been trying to sort of right the ship, but most of the tax cuts from the Trump times have stuck around. It's not been rolled back. So are there low-hanging sources to improve the revenue situation?
I wouldn't really put them as low-hanging fruit. I think if it's low-hanging fruit, we would have done it already. And the problem is that we have these pledges on both sides. And this comes in, we're talking about it on Social Security. It's there on taxes too. So you've got the Republican Party that has basically pledged to, many of them have pledged to never raise taxes. And this comes from Grover Norquist and a group on the right of the political spectrum that is called Americans for Tax Fairness, I think. I forget the name of his group, but it is a group that is, its sole mission is to oppose any increases in taxes, which is, of course, fundamentally inconsistent with fixing our budget problems. And many Republicans have signed on to that pledge. And then on the Democratic side, President Biden has made a pledge not to raise taxes on anyone making under $400,000, which gets very difficult when you're looking at the inner workings of how taxes are distributed and how certain policies would be evaluated. And that also basically precludes most tax changes from being considered, except for, billionaire taxes or wealth taxes, those kinds of things, which are, of course, have no reception on the other side of the aisle. So the universe of offsets and policies that Congress has been willing to consider has really shrunk. And we're going to need a change in that mindset in order to get serious on the revenues that we bring into the government in order to fund the spending that we want to or need to do as a country. If you just look at some things that should have been low-hanging fruit in the past couple of years as examples, so reducing the tax gap. We should all have a desire that people who owe taxes under the law are paying them in the way that they should. And we have a very large tax gap, hundreds of billions of dollars, which means that there are hundreds of billions that should be paid to the Treasury Department that are not being paid either through intentionally because people are failing to pay the taxes they owe, or in some cases inadvertently. But the government is not monitoring this in a way that is closing those gaps. And so there was legislation passed a couple of years ago that gave additional funding by the Democrats, that gave additional funding to the IRS to ramp up tax enforcement.
That became politicized too.
That became politicized, exactly. So to do more audits, and it became, the IRS going after your pocketbook. And that makes it incredibly hard to even collect the taxes that are owed under our system today. There's another example where there was a tax credit that was passed under the COVID response packages that was called the Employer Retention Tax Credit. And this was to try to help employers retain their employees while the economy was shedding jobs and we were going into a deep recession. What this has turned into is companies retroactively now claiming these credits 3 or 4 years down the road because they've been marketed by sort of a cottage industry of folks who will take a share of the credit that they're owed and promise the business that they'll collect for them. In many cases, these are fraudulent claims and they're not even eligible for the credits. In other cases, this is 3 or 4 years down the road and everybody has moved on. This is no longer an essential need of their business. And yet these claim windows have remained open, and there is tons of fraud in this program such that the IRS has put a pause on processing some of them. But this could result in savings of literally tens of billions of dollars to the federal government if they do not need to pay out these fraudulent or improper claims. And yet policymakers have not been able to shut down those activities and cut off the window for claiming this credit early because there's been partisan disagreement over what package that gets put into and what else it's paying for. And so it goes on. And these are the types of activities that we can't afford when we have a $28 trillion debt. There may be some consensus around some offsets that could go with an extension of some of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, TCJA provisions that are on the table next year, because next year is going to be a very consequential year for fiscal policy with the expiration of many of those tax cuts that were passed in 2017. So there are a number of provisions that are being discussed that could be a part of that package that could help pay for some of those extensions, but they're not enough in the scheme of things. And so we at BPC have been working on what some of those potentially bipartisan options could look like and what could be on the order of magnitude if packaged together that would really start to at least stop the digging in the direction of more and more debt and perhaps even begin to address the underlying challenge.
In terms of fraud and non-compliance, I periodically read reports of the U.S. authorities leaning on like European banks or offshore centers to disclose more information about Americans who are hiding their wealth, and once in a while you see these big penalties. How large this sort of presumed sort of non-compliance outside of the U.S. is for income that is under the worldwide taxation net that the U.S. has is sort of missing out?
I think it's fairly significant. So I do think we need to look under every couch cushion, given where we are today as a country, and look for the places that are easier to raise revenue, or bring in that revenue. So while it may be difficult to track down those folks who are evading and have hid their money overseas in various places, it's probably easier to get them to pay the taxes that they owe than it is to get the political will to raise taxes on other people. So those are places that we do need to go for. When it comes to the IRS enforcing the laws that are on the books, they have been severely underfunded for many years. And this comes back to the squeezing of the discretionary portion of the budget, because the IRS is funded out of that discretionary portion. So we need to reverse that trend. And we have started reversing it with this investment that was passed a couple of years ago in order to ensure that they have the resources they need to do the job that they're supposed to do.
Right. Okay. Tariffs. There was a time, 100 years ago, when the U.S. did collect substantial government revenues through tariffs. But we saw Donald Trump raise tariffs substantially, particularly against China, but also on a few other countries, on a few goods. Why haven't we seen the impact of these higher tariffs on revenue GDP ratio of the U.S.?
So it's interesting when you look back at the last period of time in modern U.S. history, so roughly from the middle of the last century till now, tariffs have made up about 1.5% of all federal revenues, which is very small in the scheme of things. In the past 5 years, looking at the effects, sort of the after effects of the tariffs that were put on during the Trump administration, they've made up about 2% of all federal revenues. So it's higher, but it's really a drop in the bucket. And even if the incoming administration, if President Trump is elected in the upcoming election, decides to put on more tariffs, and even if it's an order of magnitude higher than it has been in the past, it could contribute a modest amount to the solution, but it's certainly not going to pay for even the problems, the spending that we have right now, much less the agenda items that the President Trump has said he wants in terms of other tax cuts, and certainly much, much less than addressing the $28 trillion that we have racked up so far. So it shouldn't be off the table, because we need to be considering all of these options. But when I think about tariff policy, what we should be first and foremost considering is the impact or the tool that presents for labor market considerations, what is produced here in the U.S. versus overseas, for national security purposes, if there are certain products like semiconductors that we need to be producing domestically rather than overseas for national security reasons, and there's certainly merit to that. And there are other foreign policy reasons that we have tariffs on particular countries, depending on what their stances are on other issues that we care about. So the environment or labor market conditions in those countries, and those are all things that should factor into tariff policy. The revenue that we're raising as a country, I don't think it's really should be front of mind as to how we are determining those policies that affect our standing in the global environment. Those tariff policies should really be dictated by other issues, and the revenue that we collect is a byproduct of them. So given the order of magnitude that we're talking about here, I wouldn't expect or suggest that should be driving our policy in that area.
Well put. Comment, if you will, on the fiscal plans of the two presidential candidates.
What we're seeing right now from these two campaigns is really what I've been calling recently economic populism on steroids. And this is the Oprah version of you get a tax cut and you get a spending increase and you get a tax cut. And we see this each side trying to one up the other side. So there's home buyers tax credits, and there's no taxes on tips, and there's no taxes on overtime, and there's no taxes on Social Security benefits. And soon enough, we're not going to have any taxes at all. And I think that this is really a challenge that we have encountered in our political system, that it is much easier to sell your constituents on no tough medicine. Everybody can have everything that they want, and we'll deal with the consequences later. That's for another day. What that has led to is 100% debt to GDP. And by the way, that 100% level is expected to rise to over 150% by 2050. So we are really on a trajectory that should be concerning for everyone. And it is not only because it's a very large and scary number, but because it's going to make it less affordable for Americans in areas that they care about. So we're talking about things like the housing market. That is a critical issue that both candidates have talked about and that policymakers in Congress are very focused on right now, because we have a housing supply challenge, a housing affordability problem as well. And the imbalance that we have on fiscal policy is over the medium term driving interest rates higher, which is going to make it more difficult for people to afford mortgages. And it has driven inflation higher, which is making it more difficult for people to afford rent payments. And it's also more difficult for builders to create the supply that we need as a country, because those investments become more difficult propositions when interest rates are perennially higher. All of those factors are going to exacerbate, not help address the housing problem. So that's just one sector, and you can come up with other examples in many other areas where the challenges that we are seeing both parties perpetuate are going to start having real effects on Americans that they may not even understand. They may not link directly to the debt, but eventually it is going to be something that restrains our economic growth and could result in something that diminishes our standing globally, economically, and in terms of our national security. We really need to get our arms around this, and unfortunately, neither party is doing that right now. Neither presidential candidate is doing that right now. The last thing I'll mention is growth is certainly a big part of any solution that we need, and certainly both candidates are talking about policies that will lead to more economic growth. But it can't be only growth. We need policies that directly reduce the deficit. There are policies that are growth oriented, like more immigrants, like immigration reform, that could bring more legal immigrants into this country who tend to be net positives for our budget, could bring in more revenue and help grow the economy. So those are things that we should certainly think about as part of our fiscal solution, but it will not replace the need to reduce spending in certain areas and bring in more revenue in others.
Right, right. I know you're pressed for time, so I'm not going to ask you to walk me through the mechanics of debt ceiling. That drama is omnipresent. We can talk about that another day. I want to talk about something that a lot of the investors of my bank are very keen to know about or learn more about, which is the U.S. bond issuance of the federal government and the supply-demand dynamic and the persistence of foreign demand, and also some degree of sort of the maturity sort of management that the Treasury is doing, issuing more at the short end versus the long end. I mean, by and large, are you pleased with the operational capabilities of the Treasury in managing this massive debt burden?
Yeah, I think they're doing what they should be doing and what they need to be doing, given the situation that they largely find themselves in. The people who manage our debt are not as a general matter, the people who have led us to the problem that we have today. They are responsible for managing the trillions and trillions of dollars of debt that we have racked up. The share of debt that's held by foreign investors peaked during the last decade. It was actually more than a third. Now it's back closer to a quarter, so that's come down a little bit over time. According to the Peterson Foundation, the average maturity used to be more like 4 or 5 years, and it's actually now been hovering around 6 years. That's come down a tiny bit, I think, due to some of the shorter term issuance that you're talking about. But interest rates are, of course, higher than they've been over the past, half decade or decade prior to COVID. And so when we're thinking about the balance of issuances, shorter term versus longer term, in a higher interest rate environment, it may make sense to issue more short than longer term. I don't know that that's exactly why they're making these decisions, but I do think that by and large, what we've seen is responsible action from the Treasury Department. And going back to my prior answer, what they're going to be facing increasingly, regardless of which administration we're in, is a long-term upward pressure on interest rates as a result of this irresponsible fiscal policy. And that's going to crowd out private investment, and it's going to make it more and more difficult for them to manage the debt burden that we have.
Yeah. Shai, my fear is the long-term interest rate part. I think the Treasury has enough financial market participants to balance out the short-term demand. And the U.S. government is playing 4 or 5%. I think the whole world wants to own some of that. But at a 1 year, 2 year maturity. 10, 15, 20 year, which is where you should be issuing a lot of your debt. I think it's going to get harder and harder if we don't see any fiscal consolidation. Shai, the final question that I had, perhaps from my perspective, is still a bit of an known unknown, if you will, to paraphrase Rumsfeld. We've seen the weaponization of the U.S. dollar in recent years. Began with the seizing of the assets or the reserves of the Afghanistan Central Bank, and we've seen substantial weaponization with the Russian invasion of Ukraine. I hear questions sitting here in Asia that could bondholders of U.S. Treasury holders face some weaponization, some taxation, something like that in the future. What are your thoughts?
I guess I'm less concerned about the weaponization being a systemic problem and more the precarious position of the US dollar itself. And this comes back to the broader conversation that we're having here. And we've seen credit rating agency downgrades over recent years, most recently, just in the past year or two over brinksmanship and the inability to budget in a responsible manner. There's been an increase, putting aside the actual substance of our budgetary and fiscal challenges. If you just look at the process, there's been an increase in last-minute crisis negotiations, and that injects uncertainty into the economy. It increases unease both for Americans and for investors, and is counterproductive to addressing the fiscal problem. So when you look at the annual appropriations process over the last 10 or 15 years, we've had multiple shutdowns of the federal government, and we've had debt limit brinksmanship, and that really is something that is corrosive to our standing in the global economy and to our standing as the reserve currency, which is a huge benefit for the U.S. economy and leads to some of the behavior that you were talking about by investors in wanting to have the U.S. as the safe haven and invest in U.S. Treasury securities. So this coming year is going to be really important because what we have lined up is effectively an inflection point on U.S. fiscal policy. We have both the annual appropriations process, and we might get a double dose of that because they haven't yet addressed the current fiscal year's appropriations. They've kicked that can down the road, and they may kick it into next year. So we may have 2 years of appropriations to deal with next year. We know we're going to have the debt limit sometime in the middle of the year. We know that the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, many of those provisions are expiring at the end of the year. Those are going to be driving the policy debate in the United States all year long. And the choices that policymakers make on those various issues will determine over the coming years and decade whether we start bending that curve and taking a more responsible path, or if we keep digging the hole deeper. And I know that investors are watching. We know that they're watching what credit rating agencies are doing, who in turn are watching what policymakers will do. And it's not going to be, in my view, something where we're going to see a crisis coming from a mile away. But it's sort of the frog sitting in the proverbial pot where it continues to get hotter and hotter, and we continue to go further and further down this unsustainable path until suddenly we realize that investors are running away because they believe that this debt is no longer sustainable, and there's a somewhat lower chance that we're going to be able to wrap our arms around it in the future. And based on the behavior of policymakers in recent years, that's not an unreasonable proposition. That could happen soon, and it could be that one of these unexpected events, like natural disasters, like overseas conflicts, or something else, pushes us over that edge. That's why we need to get our hands around this challenge, and why we need policymakers in the new Congress and the new administration to be taking it seriously.
Yeah, and sitting here at my perch in Singapore, I will be watching that very closely. Shai Akabas, thank you so much for your time and insights.
Thanks for having me, Tamer. Really appreciate it.
Great to have you, and thanks to our listeners and viewers as well. Kopi Time was produced by Ken Delbridge at Splice Studios. Violet Lee and Daisy Sharma provided additional assistance. It is for information only and does not represent any trade recommendations. All 135 episodes of the podcast are available on YouTube and on all major podcast platforms, including Apple and Spotify. As for our research publications, webinars, and live streams, you can find them all by Googling DBS Research Library. Have a great day.